It is a pleasure to gather here today to celebrate the launch of the Dodge website. And for the museum, this conference certainly marks an important milestone. Without further delay, I am delighted to give the floor to Jane Sharp, who is a research curator for the Dodge collection and professor of art history at Rutgers University. Jane will be moderating our first panel devoted to Baltic art.
Yeah, you need to. I didn't know so many. Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I have to say I am discovering this website at the same time that you are. So I haven't really worked through it yet, but I'm looking forward to it and teaching. So I will be speaking this afternoon as well on a roundtable that addresses pedagogy, how we actually use the website. But for this panel, I want to introduce a series of speakers here who are major curators and scholars in their respective areas, regions. I will introduce them individually, but then I will assemble questions afterwards, after everyone's spoken, for the Q&A at the very end. So first, we have an online presentation by Julija Fomina, who is from the Vilnius Academy of Arts. She's a Lithuanian art critic and curator, specializing in exhibition history. She previously curated at the Center for Contemporary Art at Vilnius and has published widely on late Soviet and post-independence art. She currently heads the doctoral program in art history and theory at the Vilnius Academy of Arts. So please welcome Julija.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Share your screen.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yes, you're good. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start now then. Okay. Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today, even if only virtually this time. And of course, I'd like to start by expressing my sincere gratitude to the organizers of this conference and the entire team of the Department of Nonconformist Art from Zimmerli Art Museum for this enormous work, creating a website with a lot of visual, historical, and contextual information around the nonconformist art collection. I'm also honored to be here today representing Lithuania, and I will share some of my insights with you. So my presentation focuses on the ways Lithuanian curators have interpreted and presented late Soviet art in exhibitions since the late 80s. The key question I address is this one: how have curatorial approaches shaped the interpretation and evaluation of late Soviet art in Lithuania? My research is grounded in exhibition history. I approach exhibitions as active agents in the production of meaning. They do not simply present art. They organize it, contextualize it, and shape how it is understood within art history. In this presentation, I will briefly discuss three key moments. First, the early post-Soviet exhibitions of the late 80s and early 90s. Second, the emergence of the concept of quiet modernism in the late 90s and its impact on later interpretations of art of the late Soviet period. And third, I will turn to more recent exhibitions to highlight how late Soviet art is being reinterpreted and presented today. So in the late 80s and early 90s, art critics and curators in Lithuania sought to reconstruct a disrupted art history. They did so by reassessing artistic production of the Soviet period and by revealing the European dimensions of Lithuanian art, presenting it as an integral part of contemporary culture. To achieve these, curators developed carefully articulated exhibition concepts that functioned as interpretative frameworks. Their aim was to bring into view aspects of late Soviet art that had either gone unnoticed or had been intentionally obscured, and in doing so, to actively shape their meaning and value. A key method in this process was the formal analysis of artworks, which allowed curators to reinterpret them beyond the constraints of their original context. One of the first exhibitions to exemplify this approach was Myth in Contemporary Painting, that I show on the screen now, curated by the prominent art critic Alfonsas Andriuškevičius. It presented Lithuanian painting from the late 60s to the late 80s, often highlighting lesser known or previously unseen works. The exhibition was structured around the idea of mythical thinking. Andriuškevičius argued that artists used myth to address fundamental existential questions. He understood myth both as a recognizable visual language and as a way of organizing meaning within the artwork. Drawing on structuralist methodology, he grouped the works according to recurring mythical thinking. The exhibition redefined late Soviet painting as symbolically driven rather than ideologically determined. In doing so, it offered a way of understanding late Soviet art that emphasized universal meanings while downplaying the ideological context. The same curatorial approach, looking for hidden structures and meanings, was executed by Andriuškevičius in the exhibition Painting of Day and Night in 1990. These early exhibitions thus played a crucial role in redefining late Soviet art during the collapse of the Soviet system. They actively re-signified it by distancing it from its political context, by emphasizing formal and stylistic connections with European modernism. In doing so, Andriuškevičius repositioned late Soviet art within a transnational narrative, making it legible as part of a broader art historical canon. Similar strategies can be observed in exhibitions of the early 90s. However, we also begin to see the attempt to place late Soviet art in relation to more recent practices. An example of this approach is the first annual exhibition of the Soros Center for Contemporary Art between Sculpture and Object in Lithuania, curated in 1993 by its director, art critic Raminta Jurėnaitė. The exhibition aimed to demonstrate the transformation of Lithuanian sculpture into the object. It brought together works by established sculptors alongside those of younger artists who were still studying or had just graduated from the Vilnius Art Academy. However, the curator did not provide clear definitions of the key terms sculpture and object. Instead, she emphasized continuity across generations of artists. From a historiographical perspective, this approach shifts the emphasis from rupture to continuity. While this is valuable in re-evaluating late Soviet art as a meaningful and productive field, it also risks suggesting that contemporary artists primarily develop their work out of that past. This, however, may not fully capture the situation, as many contemporary practices draw on a much broader and more diverse range of influences. Another important exhibition dedicated to the art of the late Soviet period was Quiet Modernism in Lithuania, 1962-1982, curated by art critic Elona Lubita in 1997. Here on the screen, you see the exhibition poster, a fragment of a Christmas card sent in 1972 by the previously mentioned art critic Alfonsas Andriuškevičius to his friend, the artist Valentinas Antanavičius. Also, some of his works of Valentinas Antanavičius are part of the Dutch collection. The exhibition introduced the concept of quiet modernism, which has since become a key point of reference and an object of ongoing debate in discussions of late Soviet art in Lithuania. As the curator explained, quiet modernism is a metaphor that refers not so much to particular artists or artworks, but rather to the nature of the artistic process itself. With this concept, the curator mapped a field of semi-official artistic practices in Soviet Lithuania, where modernist ideas developed outside the official exhibition system, in semi-private or informal settings, artist homes and studios, as well as libraries, publishing houses, or cinema halls, spaces where artists could engage with abstraction, material experimentation, and non-representational strategies. At the same time, many of these so-called quiet modernists participated in official art discourse and made use of the benefits provided by the Soviet system. As Karolina Rybačiauskaitė wittily notes, artists, quote, use their officially assigned studios for quite unofficial purposes, such as presenting their unofficial artworks, end of quote. The prominent Soviet art scholar Erika Grigoravičienė has observed that quiet modernism presented modernist Soviet art as a historical phenomenon, telling a story about its gray, marginal, yet still legal zones, while also emphasizing the relative absence of politically engaged dissident culture. However, some critics took the idea of quiet modernism in the opposite direction. For them, quiet described not only the conditions in which the art was shown, but also the artwork themselves, their visual language and meanings, leading them to frame the artist as actively resisting the Soviet system. This framing persists in the curated exhibitions of late Soviet art up to these days, where artists are frequently presented as opponents of the Soviet system, and their work is interpreted through a retrospective lens that highlights dissent, critique, or subversion. An example of this framing is the exhibition Protest Art, The Rebels of the Soviet Era, that opened in 2020 in the branch of Lithuanian National Art Museum Radvila Palace, and is now on permanent display there. The exhibition was curated by the director of the museum, Arūnas Gelūnas, and based on a generous donation by jazz musician Vladimir Tarasov of his private collection to the museum. Within this exhibition, Moscow conceptualists and Lithuanian quiet modernists are presented as disobedient creators working under conditions of ideological control, censorship, and various restrictions. While it might be true in case of Moscow artists, it might not be equally true in the case of Lithuanian artists. The exhibition further constructs an image of artists as authentic, independent, and to some extent heroized figures. This reinforces a somewhat romanticized vision of the late Soviet art, in which artistic practices appears as a consistent form of resistance. Such an interpretation, however, can be critically questioned, as it retrospectively projects clear oppositions onto a past that was in reality far more complex and ambiguous in its relationship to the system. An attempt to demonstrate exactly this complexity of the past and the official system was made in another exhibition of the same year, Elephants and Chameleons, Visual Art 1978-1985, curated by Kristina Civinskina at the Kaunas Picture Gallery. The curator chose symbolic animals with distinct features to describe artists active during the Soviet era. Elephants, as she explained, are loyal animals that value rituals and traditions. Chameleons, on the contrary, possess traits that allow them to adapt to their surrounding environment. The exhibition featured works by Lithuanian painters that had been displayed in 1982 at the Kaunas Picture Gallery as part of the permanent exhibition dedicated to Soviet art, the pictures that you see on the screen now. It is quite peculiar that these works were created earlier in the 60s and 70s rather than in the 80s, which demonstrates that there were no sufficiently strong examples of ideologically approved Lithuanian paintings in the early 80s, at least not in the museums. Other paintings presented in the exhibitions were created by a group of 5 Kaunas artists who also held an exhibition at the same Kaunas Picture Gallery in 1982, and whose work both visually and conceptually disregarded ideological requirements. There were also works by already canonized quiet modernists, for instance, Kazimiera Zyblita. Some of her works are also part of the Dodge collection. The curator noted that it's up to the viewer to decide which of the presented artists are elephants and which are chameleons, and that these two positions may coexist within a single artist. However, the fact that many presented artists were publicly exhibited in the 80s at the Kaunas Picture Gallery, an official art institution, demonstrates that such straightforward labeling may not justify a proposed curatorial framework, and that the binary conformist/nonconformist scheme is not efficient in presenting the complexity of the official art system and is not suitable to evaluate the quality of the artworks. Another major curated exhibition on late Soviet art was 1972, Breaking Through the Wall, presented in the Kaunas Central Post Office as part of Kaunas European Capital of Culture in 2022. This also huge project was led by art historian Rasa Žukienė, who curated the visual art section. There were also segments devoted to music, theater, film, and fashion. The exhibition takes 1972 as its point of departure. That year, Romas Kalanta, a young man, set himself on fire in front of the Kaunas Musical Theater in protest against the Soviet regime. His act sparked spontaneous demonstrations, and in the following days, thousands gathered in the city, leading to unrest commonly referred to as the Kaunas Spring. As Žukienė explains, the exhibition sought to trace how the aura of Western freedom reached Kaunas and Lithuania, where free thought had been largely suppressed for decades. It examines wider cultural spheres in which a commitment to creative freedom found vivid expression, revealing cracks in the seemingly solid edifice of mature socialism. This curatorial framing once again emphasizes the idea of a long-standing struggle with the regime, in which artists were actively involved. However, much of the archival material in the exhibition, such as photographs from private albums, self-published magazines, and authentic objects from the period, including handmade dresses and jewelry, also reveal another layer of the Soviet era, one marked by joy, creativity, and a celebration of youth and life. This broader perspective highlights the larger context in which artistic ideas emerged and circulated, and somewhat softens the usual heroic tone of cultural resistance. The final and quite recent example in my brief overview is the exhibition Fairy Tale, Childhood in Lithuania in the late Soviet era, which was on view in 2024 and beginning of 25 at the Kaunas Picture Gallery. It was curated by an interdisciplinary team. Artist Auksė Petrulienė, art historian Vaiva Mikelionytė, design scholar Karolina Jakaitė, and museum worker who works in the documentary department, Aida Skulbokas, in collaboration with a number of consultants, including historians, scholars, and other specialists. The exhibition set out to explore the complex and often contradictory experience of the late Soviet period through the lens of childhood. Its point of departure was the legendary children's cafe Fairy Tale, which opened in Kaunas in 1960. The cafe featured stained glass panels that you see on the screen now by artist Filomena Ušinskaitė, depicting characters and scenes from Lithuanian fairy tales. These artworks, together with a highly imaginative menu, made the cafe immensely popular among local residents. The cafe closed in 1996, its interior was destroyed, and the stained glass panels became museum artifacts, eventually preserved in the National Čiurlionis Museum of Art and restored in 2022. The exhibition brought together archival materials, personal testimonies from those who were children at the time, artworks, design objects, and everyday items. These elements were arranged in overlapping constellations that extended across all gallery spaces. Importantly, the exhibition evoked both joyful and painful memories of the period. However, in my view, its most significant achievement was the absence of a narrative of heroism or artistic resistance in the late Soviet era. Instead, visual art was presented alongside other forms of material culture, embedded with personal stories and complemented by contributions from contemporary artists reflecting on the period. The broader socio-political context functioned as a framing device, at times restrictive, at other times enable experimentation within the conditions of planned economy and material shortages. By presenting late Soviet art as an integral part of everyday life, the exhibition offered a productive way to rethink the Soviet past. It moved beyond rigid dichotomies and moral judgments, and instead opened up space for more nuanced interpretations and imaginative engagement. I believe that moving in this direction, enriching art historical narratives by placing art within the wider textures of everyday life and historical circumstances, allows us for a fuller and more nuanced understanding of this period. Thank you.
Thank you, Julija. We will gather questions, I think, at the end so that we can have a shared discussion, though I, of course, have many for you. Now I am welcoming, it's my pleasure to welcome Liisa Kaljula, who is curator of paintings at the Art Museum of Estonia, and with whom we've already collaborated at the Zimmerli with the Dodge collection a few years ago during the very challenging circumstances of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. She has, let's see, she's curated extensively. She's based in Tallinn, of course, and her research focuses on late Soviet art and alternative networks. Among her most recent shows is the Harku 75 show, which is up right now at Kumu. So please welcome Liisa Kaljula, who will be speaking on Periphery as Privilege, Conceptual Art from Soviet Estonia. Thanks. Yours is PowerPoint. To share.
So when you move the slides, thing.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jane, for a nice introduction. And I'm here today to replace Ragna, who is writing her PhD dissertation. So she couldn't be here today. And I will represent Estonia. I come from Tallinn, and I work at the Art Museum of Estonia daily. Here we go.
Now it's all with one.
All right, here we go. In his seminal account on horizontal art history, Polish art historian Piotr Piotrowski tackled periphery not in terms of disadvantage or prohibition, but in terms of advantage or privilege. Even though Piotrowski wrote about socialist Poland, which has been often described as a semi-periphery between the Cold War superpowers, I will try to see in my today's presentation if this notion of the periphery as privilege could have any resonance with the art scene of the late Soviet Baltics, and more specifically, with the emerging conceptual art scene in the late Soviet Estonia. In her study of the post-World War II Sovietization of the Baltic states, based on Russian archives, the historian Elena Zubkova considered the Sovietization of the Baltics to be one of Stalin's most ambitious plans, fueled by the dream of restoring the once great empire. Even though, in Zubkova's opinion, the rigid Stalinist model of Sovietization may have been less successful in the Baltics than the following more liberal model of the so-called Soviet West. As Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were the westernmost Soviet republics, the border states of the Cold War, which were inevitably affected by the porousness of the Iron Curtain and the closeness of the democratic world. In the rest of the Soviet Union, the Baltics had also gained image as the Soviet West during the late Soviet period. The more modern and the more liberal Soviet region that was nonetheless accessible as tourist destination. And to illustrate just that, here is a postcard from Tallinn in the 1970s, depicting one of the first high-rises in Estonia, the Viru Hotel. Viru Hotel was built by the Finnish builders using modern Finnish materials, and after its completion in 1972, it really became a true island of Westernness in Soviet Estonia. Being famous for its Western-looking bars and restaurants, the Viru Variety Group attracted visitors from all over Estonia, as well as beyond, with its liberal variety shows. Well-known Estonian cultural semiotician Juri Lotman has described border cultures as transcultural blocks that are able to translate ideas from one culture to another. The location of the Baltic countries as the westernmost Soviet republics after 1945 made them a typical border culture in the Lotmanian sense. The Iron Curtain in Soviet Estonia became especially porous during late socialism. In the 1950s, American Voice began broadcasting in Estonian. In the 1960s, Finnish television programs could be reached in the northern part of the country. And in 1965, the first ferry line after the Second World War was started to operate between Tallinn, the capital of Soviet Estonia, and Helsinki, the capital of democratic Finland. Whereas institutional life in Soviet Estonia was still, of course, shaped by the Soviet regime. But how did these privileges of the Soviet Western periphery affect the Baltic art scene? One of the most remarkable changes in the 1970s Baltic art scene, at least to my mind, was the emergence of a new urban culture that was about claiming back the Baltic cityscapes from the Soviet regime. This new urban culture was most of all about the younger generation of artists organizing happenings in the public spaces and strolling the cityscapes, but also about taking photos during these city strolls and using these photos later in their creative practice. So, for example, in Vilnius, Mindaugas Navakas used this material later in his studio to imagine, with the help of miniature sculptural models and photo montage, gigantic sculptures in different parts of Vilnius. Whereas in Riga, the group emissionists turned Riga into a bizarre city, opposing the dull and grey modernist public space that the Soviet regime had built. And in Tallinn, Jüri Okas was analyzing the Soviet layers of the city, looking at it as an ambivalent space that could be integrating and disintegrating at the same time. At the same time in Moscow, as we all know too well, bulldozer exhibition took place in the outskirts of the city in 1974, clearly demonstrating that the authorities did not accept any spontaneous cultural activity in the public space. And for the younger generation of unofficial artists, the perspective that they too must live their creative lives in their apartments, as the previous generation had done, was intolerable. What followed in the consecutive years was a bigger wave of emigration of the younger generation of artists that really devastated Moscow art scene in the second half of the 1970s, right? Whereas in Tallinn, there was no comparable immigration wave of artists in any of the late Soviet decades, nothing like that. When in Moscow, the official and unofficial spheres stayed strictly divided, in Tallinn, these two, we can say, dissolved into each other during the 1970s. And the exhibition Harku 75 has often been called the last unofficial exhibition in Soviet Estonia. Harku 75 was also one of the most important discussion platforms for conceptual art in Soviet Estonia, being opened at the Institute of Experimental Biology in Harku near Tallinn in December 1975. The aim of the exhibition was to find points of convergence between artistic and scientific ways of thinking. And at the closing event, which was a seminar where young artists and scientists met, a seminar was organized to exchange ideas between those two spheres. And at this seminar, the young scientist Tõnu Karu, who was at the time working at the Estonian Institute of Cybernetics, was showing slides of breast cancer, asking the audience if this could be art. And the artist Raul Meel, who was one of the organizers and participants of the Harku exhibition, replied that in case these images are represented at an art exhibition, they could, without doubt, be called art. And by the way, here you can see familiar faces. The Moscow art critic Vitali Pachukov and artist Yuri Sobolev at the opening of Harku exhibition. Sobolev had been a frequent visitor in Estonia already in the 1960s because Ülo Sooster was his very good friend. Ülo Sooster was an Estonian artist who lived in Moscow until the year 1970 when he died there. But many other Moscow artists were often visiting Tallinn during the 1970s because of its more liberal art life, as well as like-minded artists and friends working in the city. The poster of the Harku exhibition, which was designed by Leonhard Lapin as a postcard with scientific drawings of insects invited the artistic and scientific communities to join at the event Harku 75, Objects, Concepts. Stressing the opposition of objects and concepts was clearly referring to the ideas of Western conceptualism that saw the role of the new intellectually engaged artists as creating intellectual concepts rather than handicraft objects. And the way that Lapin had appropriated scientific drawings of insects was also in line with Western conceptualism, even though Lapin was well aware that copying Western influences was not enough. Dematerialization of the art object, which became one of the main slogans for Western conceptualism, could not be adapted by the unofficial artists working in the Soviet Union, who often lacked material, proper material for art making. Instead of the critique of the commodification of art, Soviet conceptualism was influenced by spiritual dimensions, such as Kazimir Malevich's teachings on suprematism, according to which art had to move towards a certain universal immateriality or cosmic nothingness. And to illustrate just that, here we can see, I wanted to show you this one. Here we can see Lapin's early serial work called Becoming One with the Star, completed in the year 1970 when Lapin was still a student at the Estonian State Art Institute. Spiritual dimensions have often been emphasized in the histories of Moscow conceptualism. If we think about Boris Groys's article, Moscow Romantic Conceptualism, but for Lapin, the sources were more eclectic than that. In the early 1970s, Lapin was still fascinated by the Western pop art aesthetics, and as a result of creating comics-like narrative works, he started to work with the serial medium that soon became his main trademark. Being at the same time influenced by the teachings of Eastern Zen Buddhism and the concept of void, the artist started to work with minimalist aesthetics during the 1970s. And in this serial work called Turgidity, we can easily see all these eclectic sources, right? How the pornographic female figure is giving way to the suprematist black squares, and how the traditional figurative image, the female nude, a favorite of the male modernist artists, is dissolving into the conceptual void. At the end of 1970s, Lapin started working on Soviet signs and symbols, borrowing them from the Russian avant-garde and from the Soviet reality that surrounded him. He created a series of paintings known as Signs between 1978 and 1980, using images of the Soviet Estonian flag, the header of the biggest communist newspapers in Estonia, Rahva Hääl, and other mass media signs of the Soviet society, such as the word "koniec," Russian for end, which appeared at the end of all Soviet movies. Lapin's understanding of the functioning of the signs was not that distant from the cultural semiotics developed in Estonia after the Second World War. Yuri Lotman, a central figure in the Tartu-Moscow semiotic school, did not view a sign as an isolated object, but rather as a dynamic component within a larger interconnected cultural system. So Lapin probably knew that putting Soviet signs into circulation, even with a slight change or alteration, was already eroding and changing the official sign system. And this series is of course one of the works that belongs here in Zimmerli to the Dutch collection. And as you can see here, Lapin also continued working with signs later during the years of Perestroika, but then his signs became more of a play field that worked with postmodern ideas. Mari Kurismaa is another key artist who became influenced by conceptual thinking in her late 1970s works. Not only in the Western art historiography, but also in Estonia, conceptual art has often been considered a masculine field. However, among the Estonian artists at the time, Mari Kurismaa was perhaps most systematically interested in language. At the end of the 1970s, Kurismaa used the Soviet bureaucratic plaquettes to finish her first language drawings. And here we can see the early drawing. This is what I wanted to show you, sorry. And here we can see the early drawing called Believes. Usub is believes in Estonian, and this work illustrates quite well the poetic qualities that are always present in Kurismaa's early conceptual works. Kurismaa is also representing Kurismaa is also one of those artists who is represented in the Dutch collection here at the Zimmerli. And here we can see her early works, a diptych called Cloud 1 and 2. And as you can see, instead of painting the landscape with clouds reflecting in the sea, she uses the Estonian word for cloud, pilv, which she then paints as if it was a material object reflecting in the seawater. So one of the things that interested Kurismaa at the time was the materiality of language, the materiality of words. And Kurismaa also belongs to the generation of Estonian artists who represents the new urban culture, which I briefly introduced in the beginning of my talk. Together with the artist Mari Kaljuste, Kurismaa co-authors the lyrical cycle called Words in Tallinn in the year 1980. Strolling the streets of her hometown Tallinn, Kurismaa performs poetic chores in the cityscape that she has written down for herself before, such as you can read them here on the left. They are in Estonian, of course, but I'll translate for you. For example, 10th of March, Monday, I quote, "I write birds and animals on the wall of a wooden house with snow." So these words, written in the cityscape of Tallinn with snow or milk or water or crayon, are fragile and ephemeral process-based works, which later only exist in Kurismaa's machine-typed chores and Mari Kaljuste's photo documentations. Kurismaa later became known in Estonia mainly as a painter, because she was unable to keep strolling the cityscapes after having kids. However, as you can see from here, her interest in the materiality of words was also present in her later paintings, such as Landscape with a Word, finished in the year 1991 when Estonia became an independent country. And also a fun fact, when the exhibition Thinking Pictures traveled from Zimmerli to Kumu Art Museum in 1922, Mari Kurismaa was the designer of the exhibition in Tallinn, who created this wonderful conceptual solution for the show at the time when Russia started its aggression war in Ukraine. Namely, the show was that was dedicated to Moscow and Baltic conceptualism was opened with empty grey halls as a protest against the war. And Jane Sharp was one of the curators of this show, besides Anu Allas and myself. But to sum it up now, Moscow was far from being the only city in the Soviet Union where conceptual tendencies appeared in the 1970s. And as you can see from this timeline, Tallinn was also far from being the only peripheral art center that contributed to the development of conceptual tendencies in the Soviet Union. But as a lot of artists who were working in these peripheral art centers were also tied with Moscow in some or another way, their contribution has often been written into the art histories of Moscow conceptualism. But for example, what united Leonhard Lapin and Ilya Kabakov, besides their artistic convictions and protest against the Soviet regime, was that they were both representatives of minority nations in the Soviet Union. Lapin was born to an Estonian family in Rapina, Estonia, and Kabakov was born to a Jewish family in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine. And when we look at the ethnic and biographic backgrounds of several other Moscow conceptualists, then we see that they were no exceptions. Vadim Zakharov was born to a Tajik family in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, and Vagrich Bakanyan was born to an Armenian family in Kharkiv, Ukraine. Hence, the story of Moscow conceptualism is not that radically different from the stories of Paris-centered and New York-centered modernisms that the renowned Polish art historian Piotr Piotrowski criticized so harshly when he offered his concept of horizontal art history for the research of Eastern European art histories. Moscow conceptualism clearly represents a vertical art history that, as Piotrowski has described it, has systematized and categorized the geography of modern art according to the division of centers and peripheries, developing hierarchical vertical models and discourses through these models. But to really sum it up now, in the compendium, I actually wanted to, yes. In the compendium Conceptualism in Context, Polish-American art historian Marek Bartelik has described Leonhard Lapin as an outstanding Moscow conceptualist, I quote now, who proves that the world-famous brand had a slightly misleading name. But what unites Lapin with the numerous artists with diverse ethnic backgrounds who later became known as Moscow conceptualists is that his life and work were affected by Moscow, a city that attracted young artists throughout the Soviet Union with its art education, as well as the large art museums and international exhibitions, public libraries, and other resources that the center of the Soviet universe could offer. For Lapin, Moscow also represented the center of historical avant-garde, where Kazimir Malevich had worked on his enigmatic Black Square, and where his like-minded artists were working in the 1970s. However, Lapin lived and worked in Tallinn until the end of his life, because art life in the Soviet Western Periphery was more liberal and offered freedoms that were unthinkable in the center of the Soviet universe. And here we see a historical image of Leonhard Lapin and Ilya Kabakov in fur caps in Tallinn in the winter of 1974. They were very good friends, by the way, who were in regular contact until the emigration of Kabakov to the United States in the late 80s. Thank you.
Great. Well, next we have our final speaker, which will also be a remote, I believe, Maija Rudovska, who is a Latvian curator and art critic and educator based in Riga and Julija. Her work examines post-war and late socialist Baltic art history. She collaborates internationally and runs Studia, a contemporary art museum in Julija. She will be speaking today on the subject of She Wore Chanel No. 5, positioning the Latvian case within the discourse on Soviet nonconformism. Please welcome Maija. Oh, she's here. Oh, Maija, I didn't meet you yet. I'm sorry. How wonderful. Excellent.
Okay, so yours is PDF, right?
This one.
We need to.
Yeah,
if it's
I can do that thing.
Okay. And let's test it before you start to make sure that it works.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on.
Yeah.
I need to stop
Stop sharing.
screen.
It's this one. No, okay. So people can see. And I think I'm gonna try to make it full screen.
All right, and let's try to move it before.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect.
Great.
Yeah.
Hold on. He needs to check, right? Like, let's see if it's moving.
Yeah. No, it's not. No, it's not. I think.
Okay, so you need the floaty thing.
No, I think there's something like that he made
here
this
it is.
full screen. That's why it's not moving, I think.
Okay, so we have to stop sharing. Let's find it again. Let's not make it full screen then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe it's fine. Yeah. Mhm.
It doesn't.
Mhm. Oops. Okay. Yeah.
All right, is it moving? Okay.
Yeah. It's not going to be perfect, but yeah, we will see. Sure thing. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a huge pleasure to be here today, and it has been an immense joy and very enriching experience to work with the team of the Zimmerli Art Museum and to work on the like the website. I will share some thoughts today that I have on nonconformism, and I aim to critically reassess the myths and assumptions that have shaped the discourse surrounding this concept. As a case study, okay, something is not working entirely here. Something's not working because I cannot move it actually. I think I have to make full screen actually. No? No, I can move it, yeah.
Now you can move it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right.
Yeah, as a case study, I have selected artistic practices of Gemmas Kulme and Ojar Sabos. Maybe some of you know them. They were like a very famous artist couple who lived in Latvia during the Soviet times and who shaped quite a lot our cultural life.
For decades, a dominant interpretative framework, largely formed within Western scholarship, posited nonconformism as a coherent and transferable phenomenon applicable to the former Soviet Union republics. Within this paradigm, the term nonconformism was employed to designate artistic practices that in different degrees positioned themselves in opposition to Soviet ideology and its institutional constraints. Consequently, artists who expressed resistance, whether explicit or implicit, and who produced work situated in tension with Soviet authoritarian structures were subsumed under the category of nonconformism, irrespective of whether such works were publicly exhibited or remained within private or semi-private spheres. Closely related definitions to nonconformism, such as underground artists, unofficial artists, and dissidents, have been widely used. Lithuanian scholar Skaidra Trilupaitytė points out that the attention towards underground art during the Cold War era went hand in hand with one-dimensional understanding of cultural life in the USSR. She writes, I quote, "This life has often been described using dichotomous and polarized opposition between official and unofficial tendencies, so that unofficial or semi-official art was generally interpreted as born out of defiance to totalitarian ideology. The political and moral interpretation of the whole Soviet system therefore influenced the way we looked at art," end of quote. Since 1990s, revisionist and post-revisionist approaches have moved away from these reductive categorizations by foregrounding the complexity and heterogeneity of artistic practices in the Soviet context. Such studies emphasize the need of examining the specific socio-political, institutional, and cultural policy frameworks that shaped artistic activity in each Soviet republic, as it was already shown by the previous speakers. In the case of the Baltic countries, particular attention must be paid to their distinct historical trajectories and comparatively differentiated cultural status within the Soviet system. The artistic practices of Jeemas Kulme and Ojar Saabols for a long time have been presented to Western audiences as examples of nonconformist artistic production. An interview with Kulme, for example, is included in this book, Soviet Dissident Artists Interviews After Perestroika, that was published in mid-90s, specifically 95. Another important study, who all of us know this book, Art of the Baltics, The Struggle for Freedom of Artistic Expression Under the Soviets, have an article by Markel-Len Schwede, who is also discussing, who is pointing out on Skulme's and Aabol's practices. Skulme and Aabols emerged from different social and family backgrounds. Aabols originated from working-class family in which social democratic ideas played a significant role. A formative experience during his youth contributed later to his career. For example, in 1940, Aabols became an agitation and propaganda worker of the Communist Party. He later cemented his communist views while working at the Central Committee of the Trade Union of Art Workers in Moscow. When returning to Latvia in 1944, he soon managed to become one of the leading figures of the Artists' Union of the Latvian SSR. There he served as a member of the board and headed the painting section. And I must add that he was also a very active art critic and theorist, not only an artist himself. Skulme, by contrast, came from a very privileged background. She was born into a well-known family of artists that had already attained considerable recognition and influence within the Latvian art world prior to the Soviet occupation. Her father, Otto Skulme, was a prominent modernist artist and an influential cultural figure who, once Latvia was occupied by the Soviets, adapted his artistic practice to the aesthetics of socialist realism. He continued to obtain important administrative roles within the Soviet cultural system There is even a rumor that he was asked to paint Stalin at his death, basically. So Skulme's mother was also a significant artist, modernist sculptor, widely known for her laconic representations of female figure in Latvian sculpture. Sorry, I haven't included the pictures of them here. And I apologize for some bad quality pictures that were taken last minute from some books. The cultural capital and professional networks associated with Skulme's family background played a significant role in shaping young Skulme's career. In 1960, she became a member of the board of the Artists' Union, and from, I must say it's not in Latvia, it's in Moscow. And from 1982 to 1992, she served as its chair. In addition to her artistic career, she also held several political positions. In 1984, she became a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and from 1989 to 1991, she was a representative of the Popular Front of Latvia in the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR. That was basically, she was also part of the National Awakening movement. But why I'm telling this is because I want to return a bit to their youth and how they were what formed their artistic careers and what they did. So what you see is actually pictures from their time in Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, where they both actually married, and they also studied at the Leningrad Institute of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture there. And until the late 50s, their both artistic expression was largely aligned with the principles of socialist realism. But changed very soon. In 1956, they both, the couple, together with other cultural representatives from the USSR, were given the opportunity to embark on an extended journey across Europe on the cruise ship called Pobeda, Victory. It was possible due to the help by the KGB officer Bernhard Borks, who is a father of actually Janis Borks, whom I will tell more about, and who was just hanging out at their house as a child. So they developed significant relations like I would say, to the Communist Party at the time. This trip allowed them to encounter and experience aspects of the Western world that were otherwise largely inaccessible to Soviet citizens. Photographs, as you see from the journey, show this couple posing in front of the major cultural landmarks, including Eiffel Tower, Parthenon in Athens, and many other well-known European monuments. Participation in this kind of trip, of course, was restricted to a small and carefully selected group, and we don't know much about this trip. There's not much information about it given. And the period following the trip marked a notable shift in their artistic development. They gradually started to move away from the aesthetics of socialist realism and began to explore tendencies of Western art. I will show first, maybe. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Abels turned to the visual language of European modernists such as Paul Cézanne and Pablo Picasso, but he soon developed an interest in geological and earth-related themes. For example, this picture that you see, it's a bit from later, but it's from the series related to this kind of explorations. And he gradually also evolved towards a more abstract visual language. Whereas Skulme's artwork became also more abstract, and her brushwork was more expressive, and she started to focus on the female figure motifs and being influenced by the other kind of well-known artists. Actually, this work particularly is quite well-known as it represents the raped woman, representing Latvia at that time. But when they both returned, as Jānis Borgs, a very well-known artist and art critic, jokes that there was a different couple who embarked on the journey. Here are just like a few more works. And a different couple who came back. Skulme started to develop a style of charming blonde, almost similar to film stars like Catherine Deneuve. And Abels, however, looked like Alain Delon or Cary Grant. And Borg's memories from his childhood is related to Skulme's fragrance that she wore Chanel No. 5. That was, of course, something exceptional for a Soviet citizen at the time. The broader political climate of the Stalinization created certain opportunities for cultural exchange. It fostered a more liberal atmosphere and encouraged an interpretation of socialist realism. Yet another factor might have contributed. Opportunities to travel abroad were often accompanied by expectations of cooperation with state security institutions. In his memoirs, Imants Lašinskis, a Latvian KGB officer who later actually became a double agent for the CIA, mentions Skulme and Abels as individuals who, I quote, did the real work, end of quote. According to Lašinskis, such cooperation could take different forms, including that of covert KGB agents. In Russian, it's called neglastny agent, and informants, osvedomitelj. To determine the Latvian exile community, to undermine the Latvian exile community and hinder its political activities, information was necessary. Sources of intelligence included conversations with exiles, correspondence, and a wide range of publications, magazines, newspapers, and other materials that flowed into Latvia in large quantities. According to those living in Latvia could in exchange obtain materials published in the West, books and journals, but especially valuable were travels, as they allowed direct contact with the most current art. And I must, of course, mention that there is no particular, documents or any facts that would particularly show that Skulme and Abels were related to the KGB agents, but we can assume, of course, that they had lots like access to different kind of Western sources, and actually they managed to travel a lot to all the major museums. They visited basically the major European culture institutions, so many big shows. One of their visits was to the Venice Biennale in 1976 that influenced afterwards Abel's basically thinking, and he tried to organize an exhibition that in Latvia later, when he was already dead, in 1984, became as a major show that changed a lot in the Latvian art scene. The phenomenon okay, I will skip this part about Skulme, as she is like a big figure in Latvian art, but her phenomenon is particularly remarkable because she has mostly formed her public image herself instead of art historians. And I would mention that local art historian Edvards Kļaviņš, for example, writes that, I quote, "There is no doubt that fate decided that Skulme should begin her work during a time of hopelessly depressing external forces," end of quote. A formulation that implicitly frames her as an exceptional figure, almost suggesting that she was chosen by forces beyond her control. But in Latvian art historical narratives, for example, her and other people are often portrayed alongside artists who resisted the Soviet regime. And this hasn't been really deconstructed even up to today. And local historians have generally refrained from examining Skulme's artistic production in relation to her political position and the privileged circumstances she enjoyed. By treating artistic and political spheres as separate, they perpetuate a long-standing myth that art exists independently of of political conditions. Such an approach also contributes to the romanticization of a nonconformism as the primary interpretative framework through which artistic experiences and the development of artistic practices in the Soviet Union are understood. There have been several attempts to use different terminology to describe artists' work from the Baltics, for example, semi-nonconformists proposed by Lithuanian art critic Alfonsas Andriuškevičius, the one that Julija already mentioned, who has aimed to describe, I quote, conscious divergence between artistic form and content, end of quote. However, Trilopaitite argues that this term is not entirely accurate because she quotes the same variety of artifacts that Andriuškevičius discussed as an examples of Lithuanian nonconformism could, under different circumstances, also be renamed as conformist, end of quote. The cases of Jēmas Kulme and Ojārs Ābols illustrate the complexity of such categorizing. Their artistic careers, practices, and theoretical reflections should not be considered separately from their involvement in shaping Latvian cultural policy. In their artistic production, both artists could at times appear almost nonconformist, particularly in their visual language. Maybe I will go back here. For example, you can see Ābol's work on the right. In their visual language, their willingness to experiment and their engagement with modernist legacy. At the same time, their positions within local cultural politics complicate this interpretation and call for a more critical assessment of their artistic development as inseparable from their political engagement. This ambivalent position is crucial for an analysis of artistic production in Soviet Latvia. It challenges the binary frameworks that have long dominated art historical scholarship. Recognizing such complexities allows for a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between artistic experimentation, institutional power, and political participation within the Soviet cultural system. And I must maybe note in the end that Kulme had like several exhibitions about her work and her practice, and Ābols had none in his lifetime, and not even after his death until basically now. There's still an exhibition in the Latvian National Art Museum that will be closing very soon. So that is with what I will conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, she got it. And call back. Go back from here. She's here.
So we hope Julija will jump up. She is.
That's great.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, thank you. Julija, do we pronounce your name Julija or Julia?
Julija, yeah. Julija
Julija.
is the correct
Okay.
way, but I don't mind.
Turn this on. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
I've got it. Well, wonderful, wonderful talks, and really more coherent than I actually expected. It's so hard with, these very different, they are very different cosmopolitan centers, each of these locations where you focused. And yet there's one of the problems that I wanted to just raise as to lead off in questions is this notion of exhibitions, Julija, that you begin with, exhibitions acting as historical agents. This seems to me to be quite special in the Baltic countries, in all of them. And I wonder, my question for all of you really is, because these exhibitions are concept driven and because they tend to highlight discrepancies between within the language with which we use to describe nonconformism, do you think this has served as an impediment to wider integration of Baltic art into the big, historical surveys that have been presented so far? So, for example, at the Walker Art Center, there was a big show of East European art, and I was kind of stunned, actually, to learn that they were going to exclude all of, the Baltic area. It was really a Central European show. So I'm wondering, it's very challenging, and these shows are fabulous. They're written within each cosmopolitan center. And I'm wondering what you think about the constraints that you still face as curators and scholars with regards to the longer history of modernist art that have been reclaimed, recaptured. And then if you all, each of you might wish
Yeah,
to
I maybe
respond.
start because I was the first, so I had a little break. I guess it's, well, one of the problems I see here is maybe that even if we regard Soviet art as the past, it's still quite recent past, right? And it's echoes in the present a lot. And I think that maybe, this short distance, it matters. There's still, and I guess that that's why out of those exhibitions that I presented, many of them are temporary exhibitions. So they are sort of, discursive environments made with a lot of effort, of course, but these discourses, if we don't somehow transmit them further, they will only stay in the exhibition catalogs, right? I guess it's up to, I don't know, museums and curators to push these ideas forward. But then, it takes some time, I guess, and also effort to do that.
Institutional responsibilities.
And
They're
institutional responsibility, right?
Yeah.
I may just, I just remember the fact that, for instance, National Gallery in Lithuania, responsible for the 20th century art, was only opened in 2009. The project was like ongoing for decades, but the actual building with the actual permanent collection was only open 2009, which makes it a very short distance up to these days to form a coherent narrative. Yeah, that's my first thoughts on this subject for now.
I'm wondering if Liisa and Maija, if you have thoughts about that.
Maija, do you want to?
It works. Yeah. I have different thoughts. I don't know which one is more important. Maybe I will actually reflect a bit from the perspective of active curatorial position, because I work as an independent curator for many years with contemporary art, and then I also returned to academic research very recently, and what I see, what is a bit different in the fields, that when I have conversations internationally about contemporary artists from our region, then it's always kind of positioned as like, this is your regional problem, or this is like your specifics there, or something like that, instead of like maybe approaching it as something like, we are all in the discussion together in the room. I experienced something like that very recently when I brought up something also in relation to the war and how we are trying to reshape also now our maybe discourses, how we even talk about our histories and where we want to position ourselves. I think Liisa actually also perfectly brought that up in her presentation, like for art historians, it's also important to think of like how we write our histories right now, that maybe we should look at some things differently. And then in the academic field, I think it's major problem that probably Julija and Liisa can agree with is that we have lots of like blank spots that haven't been kind of researched, or there's like lots of lost already material, people, memories. For example, exhibition histories are not really written. So now when I deal with some materials related to 80s, I really struggle also in terms of documentation, in terms of like what happened, and there hasn't been anything also written really like that would give some kind of overview of what happened before. So it's almost like inventing many things from the scratch and struggling with these aspects. So yeah, I guess these two things come together in some point as well, like contemporary practices with like what is there from the history, you know, like what is written from the scholarly point of view. Yeah.
Liisa.
I don't have much to add actually, because you colleagues have been working with exhibition history for many years, whereas I haven't. But I also agree with Julija that this integration of the Baltic art into the global community, it's a longer process. It takes time. And first, we have to kind of tackle what Maija mentioned, all these problems that are our problems, like, you know, our regional problems, how to kind of decolonize our histories on so many levels. It's not, it's first of all, it's we need to decolonize them from Western art history. Then we need to decolonize them from Moscow. Well, we have a lot of job to do, I would say.
Yeah, and also I was going to add, no one is really familiar with these artists, and since some of the exhibitions are artist generated, that's a hard history to fold into Western, you know, the global art world that's still dominated to a large degree by Western biennales and curatorial practices. So there's that level too that's challenging, I think, or has been for me. Yeah, just making them visible.
Maybe I can add it there, yeah,
Yeah.
because I do my PhD on artist curatorial practices, and this is exactly my topic, and maybe not to elaborate too much here, but yeah, I think, well, my approach is that the artists were actually the front runners in 70s, 80s, who organized lots of exhibitions, but different other things, also institutions. So yeah, I also believe that there is still a curatorial history that is, you know, something that we need to write, and maybe that could give a different perspective to the art from our region as well.
Well, I would love to hear more questions. Oh, Julija, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Julija.
I just wanted to add something, maybe in relation to what Maija said, that in fact there is this, I guess, dual relation, because this term quiet modernism that I was briefly describing today, it came up from the art critical research that resulted in the exhibition and a book. But in its primarily origin, it was, it was thought of to describe the activities that were presented in the exhibition, right? So it appeared in the exhibition context, so to speak, but then later on it became a very sort of influential framing device also in the scholarly framework, and it's still used, and now it's almost became, you know, a cliche thing to say regarding the Soviet Lithuanian artist, like, oh, he was this quiet modernist, and God knows what they mean by that, you know, because the Ilona Lubita had something different to say about it. and then it got transformed, and we have this, you know, notion which is many things now, but it's exactly, it was born out of the exhibition context and research first of all, and then became a powerful tool to designate some certain group of artists, or even the stance towards the system more than the group of artists that curator was originally referring to. So I guess that these interconnections between the exhibition practices and the scholarly research, they do work, but it also takes time.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful idea, a big concept, and I was wondering to what extent it was used maybe within or familiar within other Baltic contexts, or is it specifically Lithuanian, this idea? Yeah.
By the way, museum is now preparing an exhibition which working title is Silent Modernism. Yeah, Sirja Helme and Anders Härm are curating the show.
Okay.
Yes, so it seems like it's spreading, but the time frame is a bit earlier than Elona Lobita's. They are looking at the years 1950s, basically the second half of 1950s, the first half of 1960s.
Oh, so there's yet another connection. Nice.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I would love to take questions from the audience. Yes. You? Yeah. Here.
I was very much interested in your comment on the need for decolonization from the West, but also from the East. But also my understanding of Baltic mentality, I guess, and I might be wrong. I mean, most likely I'm wrong. Is that the need for approval of the West, the need to dissent against the East, the need to be recognized, approved by the West. All those items are integral to the mentality of Baltic states. I mean, before and right now. So if you're talking about decolonization from all of that, my question is basically like, how can you extract that, and what's going to remain when those very primary drives of, again, being approved by the West and dissenting against the East would be removed?
Wow, thank you. That's a fundamental question. Yeah, you're right. I agree that it has been very Baltic thing to look for the recognition from the West for a long time. Actually, I mean, this was how the Baltic art survived the Soviet era, basically, by always keeping this connection alive, be it in silent modernism or different ways. But now, I think that now is really the time when the Baltic art historians should be able to move forward from that position. But also, I mean, what is going on in global art history now, it's all supporting that. We need to start looking the local processes, how art has developed in the Baltics. And I truly see the Baltics as this extremely hybrid, complicated border area where East and West meet. And that's the main reason why really the art historical narratives that come from either East or West are not good for us. They don't really suit us. We need to create our own terms, our own narratives, which really go deep into this hybridity. This is what I think, but it's, as I said, it's also it's a huge work to be done. How to really look at the local level.
Can I maybe add? I actually think that this is kind of a dominant discourse that's just been operating for years, you know, and that has been mainly also created during the early 90s, like late 80s. But I actually believe that we can dismantle it by just telling different narratives, or like looking beyond that in a way, because there were like so many different collaborations and practices during Soviet time that were not focusing mainly on the Western connections, that were, for example, happening within the Soviet Union. Because there's actually very little research done on like how the relations, how the networks worked within the union on its own. Actually, how artists use that on their behalf, or how they exploited it in a way as well. So I think there's also it's a bit I think about narratives, and I remember in one discussion Epanos actually said about the Soviet times that there's like many stories we can tell. It's not like one story, there's different worlds as well, like that were lived,
Yeah, wonderful. Nicholas first, and then let's see.
All three of you talked quite a bit about the kind of blurring of lines in Baltic modernism between official and unofficial, and conformist and nonconformist. And I'm curious, from your perspective, do these dichotomies still have a place in the study of Baltic modernism, or do you think that scholars working on this material ought to move away from it entirely?
Tricky question.
Julija, yeah.
Yes, I, in my view, but I can only speak on my own behalf. I'm not like now representing the majority of Lithuanian scholars here. But in my opinion, these are exactly, speaking about decolonization, we have to decolonize ourselves from maybe these two notions as well, because as I said, in the case of this quiet modernism in Lithuania, so what applied or what was referred to as nonconformist or unofficial art in Moscow was not quite the same in Lithuania at the very same time. So I guess that conformist, nonconformist, it only works if we expand on the notion what which system and what cracks within this system it operated against. Because as Maija suggested also, the same there was a discussion already in the 90s about this semi-nonconformism in Lithuania, because there was no like truly dissident artistic practices in this regard, like people use their officially given studios to produce and show unofficial work. So I see quite some problematics here, and I think it had to be this framework has to be reconstructed for us to maybe understand the complexity of that system also, rather than just these, I don't know, labels that maybe are no longer valid, or maybe we will, as Maija showed, you could be as well sitting on many chairs being one single person, and so one label is not, I guess, enough.
Yeah. And the periphery question is huge, because I know Norton, for example, developed his language around nonconformism and dissent really by focusing on Moscow and Leningrad, even though he knew artists in Estonia. And that's what is transmitted through the press to the public at large. So there's this kind of imbrication of one periphery within another in this case, which has to be challenged. Do you all have comments for each other or questions for each other? Or would you like to add something? Liisa?
Maybe I would also like to add a few words to the last question from the audience. Just to kind of say that art history it's a global conversation, basically. And that's a plus and a minus at the same time. I mean, we use the same language and we are social. we want to talk to each other. And that's the reason why we often use the same vocabulary, right? Even though this vocabulary might no longer serve us. And I think that's exactly the problem with this dichotomy of conformism and non-conformism. I think it no longer serves us in the Baltics. We should leave it behind, but when we come here to the United States, we still want to talk to you, right? So we use these words that we both know. So it's complicated to move on if we still want to talk to you and be, you know, in this global community of art historians.
Yeah, and there are other terms that are popping up now, mainly through literary critics like neo-avant-gardes, which I find equally troubling, for example. But anyway, I think we should leave it at that, unless there are any other pressing questions. We can continue the conversation this afternoon. So thank you, Julija, Liisa, Maija.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentations.